Hi everybody, it's Laura from Green Tree, and today we're talking about foods with two different names. I'm just going to kind of give you a rundown. This is going to be a relatively quick one, but hopefully some of these will be new and interesting to you. And if you know of any different foods with two names, feel free to share them in the comments because it's always interesting for me to learn more too. So, first one. You may have heard the term rocket before. Well, rocket is just the English word for arugula. So whenever you see this adorable little green, kind of slightly spicy thing up on the shelf in a grocery store, arugula and rocket are the same thing. If a recipe calls for one, you can go ahead and use the other with no problems. So that's number one. Number two, I unfortunately don't have an example for you because it's February in Michigan, but scallions, spring onions, and green onions are all the same plant. You might hear different names come up again in different recipes, but it doesn't matter. They're all interchangeable. You can use any one of them in any recipe. Chickpeas and garbanzo beans. Okay, they are also the same thing. Now, there are a lot of sub-varieties of chickpeas or garbanzo beans, whichever you prefer to call them, but they're pretty interchangeable in most recipes. Garbanzo is the Spanish version of the name for chickpeas, and chickpea is the most commonly used in English-speaking places. So, chickpeas and garbanzo beans. Sweet potatoes and yams. This is mostly a thing in the US. This right here is a sweet potato, but you'll find it interchangeably labeled as a yam a lot of the time. A true yam is much larger, much starchier, does not taste sweet, and is native to an entirely different part of the world. So, if a recipe calls for a yam and it's an American recipe, go ahead and use a sweet potato. That's almost certainly what they're talking about. But if it's an African recipe or even like a South American recipe, you might want to check because a yam is an entirely different creature to a sweet potato despite the fact that we call them the same thing. So there you go. Cilantro and coriander. This is one that surprisingly not a lot of people know about. So when you see coriander in the US, what you're usually going to see is this finely ground powder or little sort of pale yellow brownish seeds, and that's what will be labeled as coriander. So you can, well, it's backwards, but that'll be labeled as coriander. This is a spice. And it's kind of fragrant. It's in a lot of different types of recipes, but mostly savory. But this is actually the seed of the plant that we call cilantro. In England, in the UK, it's going to be called coriander no matter which part of the plant you're talking about, but here we differentiate between the two. So that lovely little green leafy thing that you're used to putting in your guacamole or sprinkling over the top of your tacos is also coriander. It's the same plant, but if a recipe calls for fresh coriander, what it's really calling for is cilantro. If something says cilantro seed, it's calling for coriander. So you just have to kind of interchange and figure out based on the context of the recipe. If something calls for a half teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon, you're probably looking for coriander. If it's calling for a quarter cup or more chopped, you're looking for cilantro. So that's one that can trip you up. Now this one's a little trickier. Mace and nutmeg. So this is a whole nutmeg. You can kind of see them on here. There we go, I got it to focus. So this is a nutmeg. You can see there's a little bit of striation on the surface, these little kind of bumpy areas. And when it's first harvested, there's like a little netting that's covering this. That's the best way I can describe it. It's like a thin membrane or a netting over the outside of the whole nutmeg. That is mace. So mace is a part of a nutmeg before it's processed for culinary use. But they don't taste exactly the same. So it's kind of like cilantro and coriander, part of the same plant but not used in the same way. If a recipe calls for mace and you can't find it, you can use ground nutmeg. It's just not quite as intense. A very similar tasting replacement that you can use is allspice, but the three of them are a very similar flavor family, and nutmeg and mace are from the same plant. And finally, I'm going to give you guys one more. Zucchinis. Zucchinis can also be known as courgettes or vegetable marrows. So courgette is kind of the European term that you usually hear for one of these guys, but it's same thing, zucchini. But if this gets big, like think the ones that your neighbors might leave on your porch in the middle of the summer, then it would be referred to as a vegetable marrow. So if something refers to having a vegetable marrow in a recipe, they're just saying you need a large zucchini. You could even use a small one, but it's going to have a higher water content, and you may need to account for that, especially if you're baking. Oh, and I'm going to throw in a bonus. I didn't write this one down, but eggplants and aubergines, those are the same thing too. They're commonly referred to as aubergines in England, UK, Ireland, well, all of the UK, and parts of Europe. It's a French term, but you can use it interchangeably, and if a recipe calls for aubergine, it needs eggplant. So that's my little rundown on plants and spices with two names. And I just want to throw this out there for you guys. If you're coming down today, what I'm going to be sampling is not any of these foods. I'm going to be doing some avocado samples. I'm doing a few different alternatives to the regular guacamole. I'm going to be sharing this avocado mango smoothie that I made, as well as this really delicious creamy dark chocolate avocado pudding that our deli made that you can get. So if you want to try any of these, come on down. And avocados are still, organic avocados are still 4 for $3 while supplies last. So if you guys need a snack, or if you have any questions about these two named foods that I talked about, come down and see me. I'll be doing this till about 6. In the meantime, have a great Tuesday. Bye guys.